Every table was full that morning, except one. And she chose it on purpose.
Can I sit with you?
4 words.
Please, have a seat.
She had no idea they'd change everything. 6 years earlier, an envelope with no name saved his daughter's life. He never learned who sent it. The world called her the Ice Queen. They never knew who she was secretly saving. She had been his secret donor for 6 years. He was about to become her whole world. "Can I sit with you?" the billionaire asked the single dad, unaware he was her secret donor for years. If you've ever wondered whether a small act of kindness can quietly change the entire course of someone's life, stay with me until the very end of this story, because what you're about to hear will remind you why kindness given without expectation is the most powerful force in the world. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because it truly helps this story reach more hearts that need it. Now, let's begin. Daniel Reyes had learned over the past 6 years that grief and gratitude could live in the same chest without ever canceling each other out. He was 34 years old, with rough hands from years of manual work, tired eyes that still managed to soften whenever his daughter laughed, and a heart that had been broken and rebuilt so many times he'd lost count. Every morning, he woke up at 5, made a lunch that was more peanut butter than sandwich, and walked his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, 2 blocks to school before catching the bus to a small coffee shop, where he worked as a barista and, most mornings, as the unofficial janitor, stock boy, and emotional support system for anyone who walked through the door. The shop, called Maple and Grind, sat wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered bookstore on a low street that most people only passed through on their way to somewhere else. Daniel had worked there for 4 years, and in that time, he had become something of a fixture. The man who remembered how every regular took their coffee, who kept a small jar of dog treats behind the counter for the neighborhood strays, who never once complained when a customer needed to sit for hours nursing a single cup because they had nowhere warmer to go. His manager, an older woman named Ruthie, who had taken a chance on him back when he showed up to the older races, and a resume full of gaps from hospital stays, often joked that Daniel ran the place better than she did, even though his official title was barely above minimum wage. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. Before Lily's mother died, Daniel had been finishing a degree in mechanical engineering, 3 semesters from graduation, with dreams of designing something that mattered. Bridges, maybe, or clean energy systems. All of that had dissolved the moment grief and single fatherhood rearranged his priorities into a much simpler equation. Survive the day, keep Lily fed, keep Lily loved, keep Lily alive. He didn't resent the life he'd ended up with. He simply carried it the way people carry heavy things they'd fence that grown strong enough to hold, quietly and without much complaint. Lily had been born with a congenital heart defect so severe that doctors had once quietly told Daniel to prepare himself for the worst. Her mother, Daniel's wife, had died from complications during childbirth, leaving him alone with a newborn who needed 3 surgeries before she turned 4. The medical bills had piled so high that Daniel had sold his car, his wedding ring, and, eventually, the small house he and his wife had bought together, with dreams of raising a family. In Beelit, he had been 3 weeks from losing everything, including, the doctors warned him, possibly, his daughter, when an envelope arrived at the hospital administration office with no return address, containing a cashier's check large enough to cover Lily's entire surgery and recovery. There was no name, no note, except for a single typed line. For Lily, no thanks needed. Just live well. Daniel remembered every detail of that first envelope, with a clarity that surprised even him. He remembered the cheap fluorescent lighting in the hospital hallway, the smell of antiseptic that never quite left his clothes during those weeks, and the way his hands had shaken so badly he'd had to sit down on a plastic waiting room chair to read the check twice, certain there had been some clerical mistake. There hadn't been, The hospital's finance department confirmed the funds were real, verified, and already applied to Lily's account. No one there could tell him who had sent it. The trail, they explained apologetically, led to a private trust with no public name attached. He had spent that first year quietly grateful and quietly haunted, glancing at strangers in waiting rooms and grocery stores, wondering if one of them might be the person who had saved his daughter's life. Eventually, he stopped searching. Gratitude, he decided, didn't need a face to be real. Daniel had wept in the hospital parking lot that day, gripping the letter so hard it nearly tore. He never found out who sent it, but it wasn't the last envelope. Over the following 6 years, whenever life seemed to corner him, when Lily needed a second surgery, when he lost his job during a company layoff, when the rent became impossible after a brutal winter, an envelope would appear. Never through the mail, always slipped under a door, left with a shop owner, or handed to him by a courier who claimed not to know the sender. Daniel had started calling this mysterious benefactor my angel, though Lily, in her innocent, matter-of-fact way, insisted on calling her the lady who loves us and doesn't want a hug. He had no idea how right she was. Evelyn Hart was, by any public measure, one of the most powerful women in the country. At 39, she had inherited a technology and real estate empire from her father, then quietly tripled its value through calculated brilliance and an almost frightening work ethic. Magazines called her the Ice Queen of Innovation. Business journals praised her ruthlessness in negotiations. What none of them knew, what she had made absolutely certain no one would ever know, was that Evelyn had lost a baby of her own, 11 years earlier, a daughter who lived only 6 days after being born with the same heart defect Lily had. Evelyn had been 28 then, newly married, and utterly unprepared for the way grief could hollow out a person from the inside, while she still had to sit in boardrooms and negotiate billion-dollar mergers with a face that betrayed nothing. Her marriage had ended 2 years after the loss. Her heart, she often told herself, had ended with her daughter. In the years since, Evelyn had built an almost impenetrable fortress around her personal life. Her board of directors knew her as relentless and precise, a woman who could dismantle a hostile takeover attempt in a single afternoon and rebuild a failing division within a fiscal quarter. Her employees respected her, some feared her, and almost none of them had ever seen her cry, laugh without restraint, or mention family beyond the occasional clipped reference to my father's company. She lived in a penthouse with a view most people only saw in postcards, employed a staff of 11, and had not taken a vacation longer than 4 days in over 6 years. Her calendar was managed in 15-minute increments, every hour accounted for, every emotion, it seemed, similarly rationed and controlled. Marisol Chen, her chief of staff and closest confidant, was one of only 3 people alive who knew about the baby Evelyn had lost, and the only one who knew about the anonymous donations to Daniel and Lily. Marisol had watched, over 6 years, as Evelyn quietly funneled portions of her personal fortune toward a family she had never met, treating the ritual with the same disciplined precision she brought to everything else. Except this, Marisol noticed, was the only part of Evelyn's life that seemed to bring her something resembling peace. You should visit them sometime, Marisol had said once, half joking, not realizing how literally Evelyn would eventually take the suggestion. It was pure coincidence. The kind that makes you believe in something larger than luck. That Evelyn had first heard about Daniel and Lily's situation. She had been donating anonymously to a children's hospital foundation, and one evening, while reviewing case files as part of due diligence for a larger philanthropic contribution, she had come across Lily's file. A single father, a dying wife, a newborn given only a slim chance of survival. Evelyn had read it twice, sitting alone in her penthouse office at 11 at night, and had felt something break open in her chest that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She wired the first donation the next morning, using a shell account so obscure that even her own accountants couldn't without a court order. She told herself it was a one-time thing. It became 6 years of quiet, careful, anonymous devotion. She followed Lily's recovery through hospital updates she was technically not supposed to have access to, always ensuring another envelope arrived exactly when it was needed most. She never met them. She never intended to. Watching from a distance, she told herself, was safer. For her, and for the fragile ecosystem of grief she had built her life around. Then, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning in early autumn, everything changed. Evelyn's driver had taken a wrong turn near downtown due to a traffic closure, and she found herself, against every instinct in her carefully controlled life, stepping into a small, unfamiliar coffee shop to wait out a phone call with her legal team. The shop was nothing like the marble and glass cafes she usually frequented. It smelled like burnt caramel and fresh bread. The chairs didn't match, and there was a crayon drawing taped haphazardly to the counter that read, "Best Dad in the Universe," in a child's uneven handwriting. She sat at a small corner table, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and noticed a man behind the counter who moved with quiet, practiced gentleness, wiping down tables, refilling napkin holders, occasionally glancing toward a booth where a little girl sat doing homework, her small hand occasionally pressed against her chest, out of habit rather than pain. Something about the scene undid Evelyn in a way she hadn't expected. Every table in the cafe was full, except the one across from where the man, Daniel, was clearing dishes. Without fully understanding why, Evelyn stood, walked over, and asked the question that would quietly rewrite both of their lives. "Can I sit with you?" Daniel looked up, startled by the elegance of the woman standing in front of him. Her coat alone probably cost more than his monthly rent, and something in her voice, tired and searching rather than commanding, made him nod, before he even thought to wonder why a woman like her would want to sit in a battered coffee shop booth instead of at the empty tables nearby. "Of course," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Fair warning, the coffee's better than the seating." She let out a small, surprised laugh, the first genuine one in longer than she could remember, and sat down. They talked for 20 minutes that first day, though neither could later explain exactly what they'd talked about. Small things. The weather, Lily's math homework, the absurdity of Evelyn's meeting running 2 hours over schedule. Daniel had no idea who she was. Evelyn had deliberately dressed down, and her face, though photographed occasionally in business press, wasn't the kind of famous that stopped strangers in coffee shops. When she left, she told herself it meant nothing, a strange, comforting interruption in an otherwise mechanical week. But she came back the next day, and the day after that. Over the following month, an unlikely rhythm formed. Evelyn would arrive most mornings around 8:30, always ordering the same black coffee, always sitting at Daniel's corner table if it was free, and always leaving before 9:15 for whatever high-stakes empire running awaited her. Daniel began looking forward to those 15 minutes more than he wanted to admit. She never talked about her work in detail, just called it corporate stuff, boring things, and he never pried, sensing that whatever she was avoiding talking about ran deeper than professional discretion. Lily, who often did her homework in the booth after school, let out early on Fridays, took an immediate liking to Evelyn. Children, Daniel had always believed, could sense authenticity in a way adults had trained themselves out of. Lily would show Evelyn her drawings, her spelling test scores, and once, memorably, the small scar on her chest from her last surgery, explaining with the casual bluntness of an 8-year-old that, "The doctors fixed my heart because a nice person helped my daddy pay for it. But we don't know who she is, so I just say thank you to the sky sometimes." Evelyn had to excuse herself to the restroom that day, locking herself in a stall for nearly 10 minutes until she could compose her face again. It was during their 6th week of quiet coffee shop companionship that Daniel finally worked up the courage to ask Evelyn to dinner. Not as a business acquaintance or friendly stranger, but as something more. He'd told himself a dozen times it was foolish, that a woman who wore clothes like hers and spoke with that particular unshakable confidence. Probably had a life he couldn't move. He pudroned for the stand. But something about the way she looked at Lily, the way she remembered small details about their lives, the way her guarded eyes softened only in that corner booth, made him believe the risk was worth taking. Evelyn said yes before she could talk herself out of it. Their first real date was almost comically mismatched with her usual life. A small Italian restaurant Daniel had chosen because it was the nicest place he could afford, with checkered tablecloths and a waiter who knew him by name. Evelyn, who had dined in some of the most exclusive restaurants on 3 continents, found herself more nervous in that small, unpretentious restaurant than she had been in any boardroom. She laughed more that night than she had in years. She let herself, for a few hours, simply be a woman on a date, rather than the calculated architect of a business empire. It was Daniel, midway through dessert, who asked the question that had been sitting quietly at the back of his mind. "Can I ask what you actually do? I feel like I've been talking about myself this entire time." Evelyn hesitated, the old instinct to protect her, carefully built privacy rising in her chest. But something about Daniel's open, unguarded face made her want to try honesty, at least partially. "I run a company," she said simply. "It's a large company. I don't like talking about it because people change how they treat me once they know." Daniel nodded, not pushing further, respecting the boundary she'd drawn. It was, in its own way, exactly the right response. The kind of quiet trust that made Evelyn's chest ache with something dangerously close to hope. Their relationship deepened over the following months with the slow, careful patience of 2 people who had both been burned badly enough to know better than to rush. Evelyn met Lily properly, this time not as a stranger in a coffee shop, but as someone Daniel Destrange introduced with visible nervousness, as someone important to me. Lily, predictably, had already decided Evelyn was wonderful months earlier, and greeted the official introduction with an eye roll so dramatic it made both adults laugh. Not everyone in Evelyn's world was pleased by the change in her. 2 of her senior board members, both allies of her late father, and deeply invested in the image of Evelyn as an untouchable, purely transactional executive, began quietly asking questions about the barista she'd been seen with. A gossip columnist, tipped off by an anonymous source inside the coffee shop's neighborhood, ran a blurry photograph of Evelyn and Daniel sitting together with the headline, "Ice Queen Thaws for Mystery Man. Gold Digger or Genuine Romance?" Evelyn's legal team wanted to issue a cease and desist. Her PR director wanted her to publicly deny the relationship entirely, framing it as a business meeting to protect the company's stock price ahead of an upcoming merger vote. Evelyn refused both. "I have spent 11 years protecting a version of myself that isn't real," she told her PR director in a meeting that ended with the director quietly resigning 2 weeks later. "I am not going to lie about the one part of my life that finally feels honest." The tabloid story faded within a news cycle, as most do, but it left a mark. Daniel had seen the photograph too, shown to him by Ruthie, who had recognized Evelyn's face from the caption and nearly dropped a tray of mugs in shock. "Daniel," she'd said carefully, "do you know who you've been having coffee with?" He hadn't fully understood the scale of it then. He knew Evelyn ran a company, but the word billionaire, printed in bold beneath her photograph, had landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. It was the first crack in his understanding of who she really was, though he had no idea yet how deep that unfinished portrait actually went. But the secret sat like a stone in Evelyn's chest with every visit. She had never told Daniel about the anonymous donations. She had never told him who she really was. Not fully. Her assistant, one of only 3 people who knew the full truth about the years of quiet charity, had begun gently warning her that the longer she waited, the more devastating the eventual reveal would be. "He's going to find out eventually," her assistant, Marisol, told her one evening. "Whether from a news article, a mutual connection, or an accident, you need to be the one who tells him, Evelyn. Not fate." Evelyn knew Marisol was right. But every time she opened her mouth to tell Daniel the truth, fear closed her throat. What if he saw the years of secret support, not as love, but as manipulation? What if he felt pitied rather than cherished? What if, upon learning she was the reason his daughter was alive, he could never again see her as simply a woman who loved him, only as the billionaire who had quietly controlled the shape of his life without his knowledge? The truth came out not through Evelyn's careful planning, but through an accident neither of them saw coming. 6 months into their relationship, Lily needed another routine cardiac checkup, standard procedure for children who'd undergone the surgeries she had. Daniel, sitting in the familiar hospital waiting room, was approached by a hospital administrator he vaguely recognized from years earlier, during the darkest period of Lily's treatment. "Mr. Reyes," the administrator said warmly, "I don't know if you remember me, but I processed a lot of your daughter's file years ago. I just wanted to say, it's wonderful seeing her doing so well, and it's wonderful that her donor has stayed involved." Ms. Hart mentioned she still checks on Lily's progress sometimes. Daniel froze. "Ms. Hart." The administrator's face shifted instantly to alarm, realizing her mistake. I'm sorry. I assumed you knew. Please, forget I said anything. I could lose my job for—" But Daniel was no longer listening. His mind was racing backward through 6 years of memory. The anonymous envelopes, the impossible timing, the woman who had walked into his coffee shop and asked to sit with him, who had never once explained what her company actually did, who flinched every time conversations edged toward her personal history. He drove home that day in a fog, Lily chattering happily beside him about her clean checkup, completely unaware that her father's entire understanding of the last 6 months of his life had just been upended. When Evelyn arrived at his apartment that evening, invited for their usual Friday dinner, she knew immediately from his face that something had changed. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply sat her down at his small kitchen table and asked, quietly, "Are you the one who's been sending money for Lily's surgeries for 6 years?" Evelyn's silence was answer enough. What followed was not the explosive confrontation either of them might have imagined in nightmare scenarios. Instead, it was quiet, raw, and painfully honest. Evelyn told him everything. About her daughter who had lived only 6 days. About the grief that had calcified into a wall around her heart. About the anonymous donations that had started as an act of philanthropic distance and slowly became the only thing that made her feel like her own loss had meaning. She told him about walking into his coffee shop that day, not knowing it was connected to years of secret checks, and realizing only weeks later, with growing horror and love, exactly whose daughter she'd been quietly saving all along. "I didn't tell you," she said, voice breaking for the first time in longer than she could remember, "because I was terrified you'd only see the money, that you'd stop seeing me as someone who chose you, and only see me as someone who felt sorry for you. I didn't want to be your donor, Daniel. I wanted to be the woman you looked at like I mattered, not because of what I gave, but because of who I am." Daniel sat with this for a long, silent moment, staring at the woman who had unknowingly kept his daughter alive for 6 years, and had knowingly given him more genuine happiness in 6 months than he'd felt since his wife died. Anger and gratitude and confusion and love tangled together in his chest, until he couldn't separate one from the other. "You should have told me," he finally said. "Not because it changes how I feel about you, but because I deserved to know the truth about my own life." "You're right," Evelyn said. "I was a coward. I'm sorry. It took time, weeks of careful, honest conversations, of Daniel processing not just the revelation, but the strange, disorienting gratitude of realizing the woman he loved had been protecting his family long before he ever knew her face. There were nights he asked her to leave, needing space to sit alone, with the enormity of it, replaying 6 years of memories through a completely new lens. There was one particularly difficult evening, 3 weeks after the truth came out, when Daniel admitted through tears he was ashamed of that he sometimes felt like less of a man, knowing how much of his daughter's survival had depended on money he could never have provided himself. Evelyn had not tried to argue him out of that feeling. She had simply sat beside him on his worn living room couch and said, quietly, "You gave her everything money can't buy. I only gave the part that happened to be easy for me. Don't you dare confuse the two." Lily, in her own way, helped bridge the distance faster than either adult managed on their own. One evening, overhearing a tense, hushed conversation between her father and Evelyn through her bedroom door, she had walked out in her pajamas, planted her hands on her hips with the fierce authority only an 8-year-old can summon, and declared, "I don't care about the money. I care that you make my dad laugh again, and you let me draw on your fancy work papers. That's it. That's the whole thing." Both adults had laughed through unexpected tears, and something in the room had loosened after that, as if a child's simple clarity had cut through 6 weeks of adult complication in a single sentence. But love, real love, has a way of surviving hard truths when both people are willing to stay in the room and keep talking. Evelyn stopped hiding behind anonymous envelopes and quiet distance. She started showing up fully, imperfectly, honestly. Lily, when she was old enough to understand the full story years later, would say it was the simplest thing in the world. The lady who loved us and didn't want a hug finally let us hug her. Daniel and Evelyn married 18 months after that conversation in his small kitchen, in a ceremony so unlike anything the business press expected from the Ice Queen of Innovation, that several tabloids ran confused headlines about her shocking transformation. There was nothing shocking about it to the people who mattered. It was simply a woman who had spent a decade grieving quietly, finally allowing herself to be loved loudly. The wedding itself took place in early autumn, in the small backyard of the house Daniel and Evelyn had bought together. Not one of Evelyn's usual estates, but a modest, sun-filled home 2 streets over from Maple and Grind, chosen, specifically, because Lily wanted to be able to walk to her favorite coffee shop on weekends. Ruthie cried through the entire ceremony. Marisol stood as Evelyn's maid of honor, later admitting in her toast that she had never, in 9 years of working alongside Evelyn, seen her employer look as unguarded and genuinely happy as she did the moment Daniel slid the ring onto her finger. Lily, dressed in a flower girl dress she'd chosen herself, specifically because it had pockets, walked down the aisle, scattering rose petals with the enthusiasm of someone hurling confetti at a parade, and delivered them so unevenly that half the aisle ended up bare, while the other half looked like a rose garden had exploded. Evelyn eventually redirected a significant portion of her company's philanthropic arm into funding pediatric cardiac care nationwide, no longer hiding behind anonymous envelopes, but standing publicly beside families who reminded her, every single day, of the daughter she'd lost and the family she'd found. She personally funded the opening of a pediatric cardiac wing at the very hospital where Lily had undergone her surgeries, naming it not after herself, but simply the Second Chance Wing, with a small plaque near the entrance that read only, "For every family who needed someone to sit with them." Daniel kept working at the coffee shop for years afterward, not because he needed to, but because it was the place where a woman he loved had once asked, quietly and sincerely, if she could sit with him, and he had said yes, without knowing that single yes would heal them both. Eventually, with Evelyn's quiet encouragement and financial backing offered so gently it never once felt like charity, Daniel returned to finish the engineering degree he'd abandoned years earlier, going on to help design ventilation systems for the very hospital wing his wife's memory and his daughter's survival had inspired. Lily grew up healthy, loud, and unapologetically herself, often telling anyone who asked that her family was proof that the people who save us don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they simply sit down beside us, quietly, and stay. If this story moved you even a little, remember that kindness rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives as an anonymous envelope. Sometimes it arrives as a simple question in a crowded coffee shop. Can I sit with you? And sometimes, the people who save our lives are the ones sitting quietly across the table, waiting for us to notice them, not for what they've given, but for who they truly are. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness matters, and subscribe for more stories like this one. We'll see you in the next story.